Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be introducing the idea of Hebrew poetry in what's going to be a continuing study of the poetic books of the Old Testament. In our English Old Testament, we start off with the first 5 books, the Pentateuch, Genesis through Deuteronomy, and then we have the historical books, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, all the way down to Esther. What we're going to be looking at are the books of poetry. Those are Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. And of course, just to round off the rest of our Old Testament, we have the prophets, Isaiah, all the way down to Malachi. That brings up the question, what is poetry? Oftentimes when we think of poetry in English, we think of things that rhyme. You know, there's a little ditty that says, "There once was a poet from Japan, whose poetry no one could scan. When told it was so, he replied, 'Yes, I know, but I always try to stick as many words in the last line as I can.'" Well, that's not really good poetry, either in English or in Hebrew, but in Hebrew, poetry is parallelism. This idea of parallelism, where you say something and then you say it again, but you say it either with different words, or maybe you use opposite terms, or maybe you just finish the thought. So parallelism is essential in Hebrew poetry. First of all, there's synonymous parallelism. This is when you say it, and then the next thing you say is going to be a synonym. It's going to be saying the same thing. So the first line, you say something, and then you restate it again. You just say it again in the second line. For example, Psalm chapter 2, verse 1, "Why are the nations in an uproar, and the peoples devising a vain thing?" Now, the nations and the people are the same thing. You know, who are the nations? They are the peoples. Who are the peoples? They are the nations. And when they're in an uproar, they're also devising a vain thing. So they're doing the same thing. You just use different terms in the second line. Psalm chapter 2, verse 2, you can just go to the next verse. "The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together." Notice kings of the earth and rulers, those are the same thing. Take their stand, take counsel together. One line helps to further elaborate on the other line. We get down to verse 4. "He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord scoffs at them." Notice that laughing and scoffing, that's just 2 ways of saying the same word. He who sits in the heavens, who is that? It is the Lord that we're speaking of. The next type of parallelism is going to be antithetical parallelism. That's just the opposite. In synonymous parallelism, you say it and then you say it again. In antithetical parallelism, you say it and then you express that truth in opposite terms, or you say it's opposite, but it's the antithesis. It's saying the opposite thing. So the first line is followed by its opposite in the second line. Let's look at some examples. "For you are not a God who takes pleasure in wickedness. No evil dwells with you." You're not one sort of God. No evil dwells, and it's saying the same thing, but it's saying it in opposite sorts of ideas. The next type, and these are our 3 major types. There's going to be a number of other subsets, but these are going to be the 3 major ones, are what we can call synthetic parallelism. In a synthesis, you just add to it. You finish the thought so that the second line continues and expands the thought that is begun in the first line. "I was crying to the Lord with my voice." This is Psalm chapter 3, verse 4. "And he answered me from his holy mountain." And then we have this funny little word, Selah, which they don't translate it. That's just the Hebrew word. Probably has some sort of musical notation, or maybe a pause or something like that. But notice, "I was crying to the Lord with my voice." And the second line, it doesn't repeat it. It doesn't say its opposite. It just finishes the thought. The rest of the thought is, "And he answered me from his holy mountain." Now, some other types that we also see. Emblematic parallelism. In emblematic parallelism, that which is spoken of serves as an emblem. "As a deer, or as the deer pants for the water brooks, so my soul pants for you, O God." And so, notice, a deer is what you're describing, but it represents, it symbolizes, it looks like my soul. In the same way that you can sort of envision this deer, and he's hot, and his tongue's hanging out, and he's panting, he's thirsty, and my soul is thirsty as well. It helps us to visualize. I can't look at my soul. I can't visualize. Don't know what a soul looks like, but I know what a deer looks like. And when I see it, it helps me to understand what my soul is doing. Here's another very, very familiar one. The Lord is my shepherd. Now that's a figure of speech. We're going to get into that later on. But the Lord is my shepherd. And so you have this vision of the shepherd, and you see the Lord in that. And because the Lord is my shepherd, I have all that I need. I shall not want. Next we move to a climactic parallelism, and perhaps this will serve as a climax for our short little foray into parallelism. Climactic parallelism is seen, for example, in Psalm chapter 29. You start off with the superscription, Psalm of David. We're going to talk more about the superscriptions later on. But the psalm now starts off, "Ascribe to the Lord, O sons of the mighty. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name. Worship the Lord in holy array." Notice the repetition there, that threefold ascription, and it gets higher and higher and higher. But it doesn't stop there. We continue in verse 3. "The voice of the Lord is upon the waters. The God of glory thunders. The Lord is over many waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is majestic. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars." Yes, the Lord breaks in pieces the cedars of Lebanon. He makes Lebanon skip like a calf, and Syrian like a young wild ox. The voice of the Lord hews out flames of fire. Notice how the action is intensifying with the repetition. The voice of the Lord, the voice of the Lord, and he breaks and he breaks. Verse 8. "The voice of the Lord shakes the wilderness. The Lord shakes the wilderness of Kadesh. The voice of the Lord makes the deer to calve and strips the forest bare, and in his temple everything says glory." Notice how it has risen in intensity to that crescendo where everything says glory. But that's not the end of the psalm. I had that rising action. That's the climactic statement. But now I have a postlude. Verse 10, "The Lord sat as king at the flood. Yes, the Lord sits as king forever. The Lord will give strength to his people. The Lord will bless his people with peace." As we said, we have parallelism. Now we're going to look at several psalms, or actually just one really, and note the types of parallelism. We'll just look for the type, and judging from what we've just seen, we'll see if we can determine what it is. This parallelism it usually is going to consist of 2 lines, or we can call them colons. Sometimes there'll be 3, but more often than not, it's going to be 2 lines. Psalm chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. "Why are the nations in an uproar, and the peoples devising a vain thing?" We already noted that nations and people are the same thing, and uproar, and they're devising a vain thing. And so there's that parallelism. Next we have the first part of verse 2, "The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together." Again, we noted that the kings and the rulers, those are the same people. They take their stand, they take counsel together. That's explaining what it is to take their stand. Thirdly, against the Lord and against his anointed. And so notice the parallelism there is against the Lord, that's the name of God, and against his anointed. The way you say anointed in Hebrew is Messiah, or if you want to translate that into Greek, as the New Testament, when it quotes this passage, does, against his Christ. Going on to verse 3, saying, "Let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us." Notice tearing their fetters apart, casting their cords away from us. Those are the same thing. That's in parallel. Verse 4, "He who sits in the heavens laughs," and laughing and scoffing are the same thing. The one who sits in the heavens is the Lord. And then verse 5, "He will speak to them in his anger and terrify them in his fury." His anger and fury. Those are in parallel together. Verse 6, he says, but as for me, I have installed my king. And the next line doesn't repeat that. It's finishing the idea upon where has he installed the king? Upon Zion, my holy mountain. And so this is that synthetic sort of parallelism. Verses 7 and 8. Verse 7 says, I will surely tell of the decree of the Lord. And that almost introduces. So I think maybe we have not one, but or two, but three lines here, because that introduces the next section. And here's the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. And maybe we could put that he said to me in as a parallel to I will surely tell the decree of the Lord. But now, here's that decree. You are my son. Today I have begotten you. So that my son, that's what a begotten is. It is someone who's your son. And a begotten one is that son, and the son is that begotten one. Verse 8, ask of me, and I will surely give. So we have the asking, but then that idea is finished in the next line. I will surely give. What's he going to give? The nations as your inheritance, and the very ends of the earth as your possession. Notice inheritance and possession are the same thing. Nations, the ends of the earth, that's the same thing. Next verse, you shall break them with a rod of iron. You shall shatter them like earthenware. Breaking and shattering, that's describing the same thing. Verse 10, now therefore, O kings, show discernment. Take warning, O judges of the earth. Kings, judges, those are people in authority. Take discernment, take warning, show discernment, take warning. Saying the same thing. And finally we have worship the Lord with reverence and rejoice with trembling. Notice reverence and trembling have the same idea. Worshipping and rejoicing, that's both coming to the Lord with that which he deserves. Saying the same thing. Verse 12, do homage to the Son, that he not become angry and you perish along the way. If we were putting this in lines, we might do that in two. I did it 2 lines. I guess we could make 3 out of that. Do homage to the Son, that he not become angry. And notice, if he becomes angry, you'll perish in the way. So there's a parallel there. And finally, the last part of verse 12, for his wrath may soon be kindled. And then, is this the opposite? Is this something different? Maybe it's almost standalone. But I take it as the opposite. His wrath could be kindled. But on the other hand, for those against whose wrath is not coming, how blessed are all who take refuge in him. You can either be outside of him, in which you face the wrath, or you can be with him. You can take refuge in him, and instead you find blessing.